She was huddled beside a trash bin, trembling amid shouted curses and flying stones. Ethan charged into the dark alley, and when she lifted her eyes to meet his heart seemed to stop. Those eyes were exactly like a child he had once failed to save on the battlefield. The girl ran. Ethan stood there frozen, and he knew he could not turn his back one more time. Dust from the road billowed thickly, clinging to Ethan's clothes, as if it were trying to remind him that the journey home had never truly ended. He stood still for a moment, looking around at streets that should have felt familiar, yet now seemed strangely foreign. Ethan let out a sigh and was about to walk on when a shrill scream rang out from an alley across the street. "Dirty little devil, get out of here." His heart began to race. A soldier's instinct etched deep into his bones, after years spent far from home, sent his feet moving toward the sound before reason had a chance to intervene. He vaulted the line of shrubs, turned into the narrow alley, and the sight before him made his blood boil. 5 children, each around 11 or 12 years old, were standing in a loose circle around a small, huddled figure beside a trash bin. They held stones and crushed aluminum cans, their mocking voices rising and falling. "Your mom ditched you, didn't she? Nobody cares about a stinky little devil like you. Go live somewhere else. You're making the whole neighborhood stink." Ethan saw clearly who they were targeting. A thin little girl, her hair matted and tangled, her clothes old and smeared with mud. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she could disappear into the shadows. But what froze Ethan in place was her eyes filled with terror and despair, like a trapped animal cornered with no way out. "Stop." His voice rang out strong, decisive, carrying the kind of authority that only comes from having stood face to face with death. The children spun around, staring at the tall man in a rumpled military uniform, his gaze cold and unyielding. They stood rooted to the spot, none of them daring to move. "All of you, go home." Now, Ethan ordered his low voice, leaving no room for argument. One of them tried to protest. "But sir, that girl, I said, go home." Ethan stepped forward, and this time no one said another word. They scattered in a rush, their footsteps echoing through the empty alley. Ethan turned back to the girl. Lily was still curled up there, her body shaking uncontrollably. He approached slowly, deliberately softening his voice. "Are you all right?" But just as he reached out to help her stand, those frightened eyes lifted and locked onto his, and like a tidal wave, the memories came crashing back, screaming. Another child in a faraway place. The sharp smell of burning gunpowder in the dry air. Small hands trembling, reaching up from beneath the rubble. He had been too late. He was always too late. Ethan staggered back a step, breathing hard. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his heart pounding as if it might burst from his chest. That single instant, the look in Lily's eyes and the eyes of the child in Kabul was terrifyingly identical. The same fear, the same helplessness. I just want to help," he said, his voice rough and hoarse. But Lily didn't wait another second. She sprang to her feet, backed away, then turned and ran. Her bare feet splashed through a filthy puddle, the sound of her small footsteps fading down the alley. Ethan stood frozen still, holding the tissue he had meant to offer her, now nothing more than a crumpled scrap in his trembling hand. He sank down onto a set of steps, clutching his head in both hands. His ragged breathing refused to calm. The sounds around him, cars passing, people talking, dogs barking, seemed to recede, swallowed by a vast emptiness. In his mind, only one thought remained. The battlefield had followed him home, not in the form of bullets or explosions, but in eyes, in screams that made no sound, and in the sense of helplessness, the feeling that no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he tried it, would never let him go. Ethan looked down at his hands. They were still shaking. He clenched his fists, trying to steady them, but his fingers refused to obey, just like everything inside him beyond his control. And somewhere in the darkness, Lily was still running, alone, with nowhere to turn. Just like him. Ethan woke before dawn, sweat soaking through the thin mattress beneath him. The dream from the night before, or rather the nightmare, still lingered with painful clarity. Lily's eyes. The eyes of the child in Kabul. They overlapped and intertwined until he could no longer tell where the past ended and the present began. He sat up, bracing his hands on his knees, trying to force the images out of his head. Forget it. It's none of your business, he reminded himself, the voice in his mind hard and sharp, like an officer giving orders. Today he had to look for work. He had to earn money. He had to keep going. What happened yesterday was just a small incident, a moment he happened to pass by. Nothing more, nothing less. But when he stepped out onto the street, an old dog-eared job paper in hand, the images refused to let go. Lily's eyes. The way she had curled in on herself, the way she had run as if he were the danger. Ethan stopped in front of the small corner grocery store, the one where the elderly owner usually posted help-wanted notices. He was about to go in when he noticed a familiar small figure standing at the counter. Lily. She was standing on her tiptoes, reaching for a package of cookies on a high shelf. Her small hand stretched up, brushing the corner of the package, but she didn't have the strength to pull it down. She tried again this time, straining harder, but still couldn't manage it. Ethan stood outside the glass door, watching. He wasn't sure why he didn't go in right away. Maybe he was afraid she would run again. Maybe he wasn't ready to face that feeling of helplessness one more time. Finally, Lily set the cookies down on the counter. She pulled a handful of loose change from her pocket, dark worn coins, bent and grimy, probably picked up here and there. She counted them one by one, her lips moving softly, as if afraid of making a mistake. The shop owner looked at her, then nodded and accepted the money. Ethan stepped inside. The doorbell chimed softly, and Lily startled, turning around. When she recognized him, she took a step back, clutching the package of cookies tightly to her chest. Her eyes were still wary, but this time less panicked. "Don't worry," Ethan said, gently keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to know if you're okay." Lily didn't answer. She simply stood there watching him, as if calculating whether she should run. Then a faint draft from the store door drifted past, carrying her scent with it. Ethan wrinkled his nose, not in disgust, but in recognition. It wasn't just the smell of someone who hadn't bathed. It was the smell of ointment, cheap, sharp-smelling ointment commonly used on scrapes. Mixed with that was the musty odor of damp clothes, as if they hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. The smell of loneliness, the smell of someone trying to survive one day at a time without a caring hand ever reaching out. Ethan glanced down at Lily's hands. She was holding the cookies, but her wrist was swollen and red, as if she had tripped or struck something. She tried to hide it by tugging her sleeve down, but it was too late. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice gentle but steady. Lily shook her head quickly and turned away, but this time Ethan didn't let her disappear. He stepped back outside and followed her at a distance close enough not to lose sight of her, far enough that she wouldn't feel threatened. Lily walked through narrow side streets, turning into alleys he had never noticed before. She moved quickly, but she didn't run. Maybe she thought no one cared where she went. But Ethan did. He didn't know why, but with every step she took, something in his chest tightened, as if he were watching himself, a younger version, more lost, more abandoned. At last, Lily stopped in front of an old wooden house at the edge of town. There was no fence. The paint was peeling, the windows cracked and patched with tape. The front yard was littered with trash, empty bottles, cigarette packs, discarded junk no one had bothered to clean up. Lily stood at the door, hesitating. Then she took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for something, and pushed the door open and went inside. Ethan remained at the corner, staring at the house. Curiosity and unease twisted together in his chest. He knew he shouldn't follow any farther. He knew this was a line he wasn't supposed to cross. But Lily's eyes, that look, wouldn't let him go. He moved closer, one step at a time, as if walking straight into the lion's den. Each step felt heavy, not with fear, but with the knowledge that once he crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. And whatever he was about to discover would change everything. Ethan stood in front of 47 Willow Street, feeling as though he were facing an invisible wall, a wall separating his world from Lily's. He looked through the grimy window. Inside, the flickering light of an old bulb illuminated a scene that made him squint just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. An elderly woman, her hair completely white, her back bent, dressed in a frayed nightgown, stood by the stove. She was cooking, but what she was putting into the pot wasn't food. There were dried leaves, scraps of newspaper, and something that looked like pieces of cardboard. She stirred steadily, muttering words no one could quite make out, as if she were carrying out some kind of sacred recipe. Ethan felt his throat go dry. This was Lily's grandmother. Then he saw Lily. The girl was kneeling on the old wooden floor, a damp rag in her hand, scrubbing at stains that had long since seeped into every crack of the boards. Sweat soaked her forehead, but she didn't stop. She scrubbed again and again, as if believing that if she worked hard enough, the house might somehow become clean. "Grandma, I've cooked the rice." "Come eat," Lily said softly, her voice tired but patient. Margaret, Lily's grandmother, turned to look at her, but her eyes were empty, as though she didn't recognize the child standing before her. "Where's your mother?" "Where did she go?" the old woman asked, her voice trembling. Lily bit her lip, tears welling up, but she forced them back. "Grandma, my mom's gone. It's just you and me now." "She left me," Margaret asked, her tone innocent like that of a child. Lily nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, Grandma, but I'll take care of you, I promise." Ethan felt his heart tighten until it hurt. He couldn't watch anymore. He stepped back out of the yard, breathing hard as if he'd just run a long distance. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, then he stopped. Who would he call social services? And then what Lily would be taken away. Her grandmother sent to a nursing home, and Lily would be alone. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned away. This isn't your problem. You can't save everyone. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the image of Lily kneeling on that damp, filthy floor would not leave his mind. That night the rain came down hard. Sheets of rain hammered against the tin roof of the rented room where Ethan was staying. The noise relentless. He lay on the narrow bed, eyes closed, trying to sleep, but the rain wouldn't let him rest. That leaking roof. He turned onto his side, trying to push the thought away. Then another memory surged up, one he had buried deep. A rainy night in Kabul. Rain pounding on the tents. A friend, Marcus, lying in a dark corner shaking with fever. Ethan had promised he would come back. But the next morning when the mission ended, Marcus was gone. He had been transferred somewhere else. Ethan never saw him again. Ethan sat up, clutching his head in both hands. The rain kept falling like an endless accusation. You left him behind. You broke your promise. He knew it wasn't his fault. He knew that in the military, sometimes you don't get to choose. But the guilt still followed him day after day, hour after hour. And now, Lily, a little girl he barely knew, was out there alone in a house no one cared about. Could you leave her behind too? The question rang clearly in his mind. Ethan stood up, pulled on his jacket, and stepped out into the rain. He didn't know what he was going to do. He only knew that if he did nothing right now, he would never forgive himself. He walked through puddles, rain soaking his clothes, but he didn't stop. He headed toward Willow Street, toward number 47, toward the little comrade he could not leave behind. Ethan stood outside the gates of Oak Ridge Elementary School early that morning. The school bell rang out. Children poured into the yard in a noisy stream, laughing, shouting, running. Ethan stood beneath an old oak tree, his eyes scanning every face. And then he saw her. Lily. She was moving slowly, her shoulders slumped, an oversized backpack hanging from her back, as if it might pull her down. Her face was pale, her lips dry and cracked. Every step she took was unsteady, as though she were using the last of her strength just to keep moving. Ethan frowned. Something was wrong. She was sick. Lily reached the steps at the school entrance. 1 step, 2. Then suddenly her legs gave way. She reached for the railing, but missed. Her body pitched forward, her knees buckled, and she fell hard onto the cold concrete. Lily, Ethan shouted. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside her. Lily's face was flushed, sweat soaking her skin, her breathing shallow and rapid. He placed his hand on her forehead, burning hot. A high fever. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice shaking with worry. Lily's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, looking at him as if she didn't recognize him. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Ethan looked down at her hands, one clenched tightly around the other arm. Gently, he eased her grip open. When he pushed up her sleeve, he froze. A burn. A large burn ran along Lily's forearm from her wrist nearly to her elbow. But it wasn't an ordinary burn. It was badly swollen, the surrounding skin, angry red, oozing thick yellow fluid. And smeared across the wound was a gritty white substance like flour packed into the injury mixed with pus and discharge. Ethan's stomach twisted. Who had done this? Who had allowed a child to suffer like this? "Whew. What did you put on this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily tried to shake her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. Grandma said flour would help it heal. Ethan closed his eyes, forcing down the surge of rage rising in his chest. Not anger at Margaret, the elderly woman who no longer understood what she was doing, but anger at the system itself. A system that allowed a child to care for herself and an ailing elder without anyone ever stepping in. He pulled out his phone, ready to call an ambulance, then stopped. If he called, they would take her to the hospital. They would ask questions. They would investigate. And Lily would be separated from her grandmother. Ethan looked down at the girl's face, exhausted, yet still trying to endure in silence. He remembered being injured on the battlefield, remembered the helplessness of not knowing who would come to help, remembered the fear of being left behind. No, he would not let Lily feel that way. "All right," he said firmly. "Don't worry, I've got you." He bent down and gently lifted Lily into his arms. She was frighteningly light. He held her close, trying to keep her warm, and hurried toward the old pickup truck he had borrowed from a former friend. "Where are you taking me?" Lily asked weakly. "To see a doctor." "You need treatment right away," Ethan replied as he opened the door and carefully laid her on the back seat. But I don't have any money," Lily whispered, tears welling again. Ethan turned back to her, his eyes softening. "You don't have to worry about money. I'll take care of it." Lily looked at him, confusion and gratitude mingling in her eyes. Why are you helping me?" The question stopped him. He didn't know how to explain it. Maybe because he saw himself in her lost, abandoned soul. Maybe because he was tired of always walking away from people who needed help. Maybe because saving Lily was the only way he could save himself. "Because I can't leave you alone," he finally said, surprised by how true it sounded. He closed the door, hurried into the driver's seat, started the engine, and headed straight for the medical center. On the road, he glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror. She was curled up, clutching her injured arm, but her eyes for the first time were no longer filled with fear. Instead, there was trust. Trust that someone would help her. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The decision was made. No more standing by. No more backing away. From this moment on, he would act for Lily, for himself, for everything he had lost and refused to lose again. The truck sped down the road, leaving the dark clouds slowly breaking apart behind it. And in Ethan's chest, a small flame, the flame of hope, began to burn. The harsh white lights of the emergency room glared down, forcing Ethan to squint. The sharp smell of antiseptic, the smell he had loathed during his years on the battlefield, now felt strangely familiar. He sat on a hard plastic chair, elbows braced on his knees, eyes fixed on the treatment room door where Lily was being cared for. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with tired yet kind eyes, came out peeling off her rubber gloves. She looked at Ethan and gave a small nod. "She's stable. The burn was fairly badly infected, but fortunately we caught it in time. If it had gone on much longer..." She stopped, leaving the sentence unfinished. Ethan let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, doctor. Can she go home?" The doctor shook her head. "We need to keep her here at least 2 days for observation, and..." She hesitated. "We've contacted social services, They'll be here shortly. Ethan felt his heart pound. Well, she didn't do anything wrong. It's not about the child, the doctor said gently. But by law we're required to report signs of neglect. Her guardian, Margaret, where is she? Before Ethan could answer, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Rushed footsteps, a trembling shout, police voices trying to calm someone down. The ER doors flew open and Margaret burst in white hair, disheveled nightgown, wrinkled eyes, wild with panic. Where is she? Where is my granddaughter? She cried, her voice shaking with fear. 2 police officers followed, trying to restrain her, but Margaret struggled with surprising strength for someone her age. Don't touch my grandchild, I have to treat her, I have family medicine. Ethan stood and stepped forward. Mrs. Margaret Lilly is being treated by the doctors. She's all right now. Margaret turned on him, suspicion filling her eyes. Who are you? Why are you here with my granddaughter? I brought her here, Ethan said softly. She had a high fever and her burn was infected. No, that's not true. Margaret shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. I treated her. Our family remedy, it will heal her. Don't listen to doctors, they just want money. The doctor approached, her voice calm. Mrs. Margaret Lilly needs proper medical care. Do you remember what you put on her wound? Margaret hesitated as if searching her memory. Medicine? Ointment? I got it from the cabinet. White. Smelled like mint. The doctor turned to Ethan and sighed. Could you step outside for a moment? I need to speak with her. Ethan nodded and walked into the hallway. He leaned against the cold wall, closed his eyes, and tried to steady himself. Then the doctor's voice carried out from inside, patient but heavy with sadness. Mrs. Margaret, do you know what you put on Lily's wound? That wasn't ointment. It was toothpaste. Ethan opened his eyes, feeling as though the ground had dropped out from under him. She's in an advanced stage of Alzheimer's. The doctor continued, her voice low. She can no longer distinguish medicine from everyday items. She thought toothpaste was ointment. She thought flour was medicinal powder. She didn't mean to harm the child. She was trying to help her in the only way she believed was right. Ethan felt his legs give out. He slid down and sat on the cold hallway floor. The anger he had been holding on to since morning, anger at the system, at the injustice, dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching bitterness. There was no villain here, only victims. Through the crack in the door, he saw Margaret sitting hunched in a chair, clutching her head, trembling. She wasn't cruel. She was a frail old woman, her memory stolen by illness, trying to care for the granddaughter she loved but could no longer protect. And Lily was just a child struggling to survive day by day, caring for her elderly grandmother, trying to heal her own wounds, never knowing that what her grandmother used was the very thing making them worse. Ethan closed his eyes, tears spilling over. He hadn't cried since leaving the battlefield, but now he couldn't stop, not from pain, but from helplessness. How could a child endure something like this? The doctor stepped out and looked at him with sympathy. Are you related to them? Ethan shook his head. No, I'm just a neighbor. Then why are you here? He was silent for a moment, then said, because no one else was. The doctor nodded as if she understood. Social services will arrive soon. They'll assess the situation. Most likely, Mrs. Margaret will be placed in a care facility and Lily will be put into foster care. Ethan lifted his head. She'll be separated from her grandmother. That's the most likely outcome, the doctor admitted. Mrs. Margaret can no longer care for herself, let alone a child. Ethan pressed his lips together. He knew it was the right decision, but he also knew that if Lily were separated from her grandmother, she would lose the only family she had left. She would be alone again, just like him. Is there any other option? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. The doctor studied him, puzzled. What kind of option? Ethan stood up and met her gaze. If someone were willing to take care of both of them, Margaret and Lily. The doctor was silent, weighing his words. Then she said, "You're talking about yourself." Ethan nodded slowly but firmly. Yes. I am. Lily opened her eyes as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the hospital room window. Her throat was dry, her body weak, but the fever had broken. She looked around the stark white room, the smell of medicine, the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Fragments of memory surfaced. The soldier had lifted her into a truck and brought her here. She turned her head, searching for a familiar presence. Grandma. Where's my grandma? No one answered. She sat up, her small hand tugging at the IV line until the needle slipped out of her vein. She didn't care. All she wanted was to find her grandmother. She stepped into the hallway barefoot on the cold tile. Her eyes scanned every face, nurses, patients, family members, but Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Then she spotted Ethan. He was standing at the far end of the corridor speaking with a woman in a black suit, a social worker. Lily ran to him and grabbed his sleeve. "Sir, where's my grandma?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan turned around, his face pale. He knelt down to her level but couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. "Lily, your grandmother. Where is she?" Lily pressed, her voice rising, panic setting in. The woman in the suit stepped in, her tone gentle but distant. "Lily, your grandmother has been taken somewhere safe, a place where people can take better care of her. She's very sick, sweetheart. You understand, don't you?" Lily shook her head fiercely. "No, I want to see Grandma. I have to take care of her." "You can't do that anymore," the woman said. "You're too young, and your grandmother needs professional care." Lily turned to Ethan, tears streaming down her face. You promised you'd help me. Why did you let them take my grandma away?" Ethan felt his heart clamp tight. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to say he had tried. He wanted to say this was best for both of them, but the words felt hollow, useless. He began, but Lily cut him off. "You're a bad person," she screamed, her voice raw with anger and despair. "You took my grandma away. You lied. You didn't help me. You just made everything worse." Each word cut into Ethan like salt in an open wound. He stood up and took a step back, as if physically pushed away by the accusation. He looked at Lily, her eyes red and swollen, her face soaked with tears, her small hands clutching her hospital gown as if it were the last thing holding her upright. The woman in the suit placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Don't worry. We'll find you a new family, a family that can take better care of you." "I don't need a new family," Lily screamed. "I just need my grandma." But no one listened. The woman led Lily away despite her struggling, despite her sobbing. Her cries echoed down the long hallway, cries filled with loss, with loneliness. Ethan stood frozen, watching the small figure disappear behind a closing door. He wanted to run after her, to pull her into his arms and tell her everything would be all right. But he knew he couldn't. He was just a stranger. He had no right. The doctor approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing. The child and Mrs. Margaret will both be better cared for." Ethan nodded, but the words brought him no comfort at all. It was dark by the time he returned to his rented room. He opened the door and stepped into the cramped space, a single bed, an old wooden table, a mildew-stained wardrobe. He sat down on the floor, his back against the cold wall, and closed his eyes. Lily's voice still rang in his head. "You're a bad person." He knew she didn't understand. She didn't know that letting Margaret stay with her would only have made things worse. She didn't know how hard he had tried to help them both, but even knowing that her accusation burrowed deep inside him like a wound that wouldn't heal. He opened the wardrobe and pulled out an old bottle of whiskey, the one he'd hidden there the day he came home. He stared at it, his fingers trembling as he twisted the cap. The sharp smell of alcohol drifted up, carrying memories of nights spent trying to forget the battlefield, trying to forget the faces of comrades who never came back. Drink, drink, and forget. He raised the bottle to his lips, then stopped. Lily's face flashed before him again, crying, screaming desperately, searching for the only family she had. "If you drink, you'll be no different from before. Running, abandoning, Powerless, Ethan lowered the bottle and set it on the floor. He stared at it for a long moment, then pushed it away. No. He couldn't run this time. He couldn't abandon Lily the way he had abandoned Marcus. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. Somewhere in this town, Lily was lying in a strange bed, in a strange place, alone and frightened. And Margaret was in a nursing home, unable to remember why she was there. You did the right thing, he told himself. Then why does it hurt this much? He knew the answer. Because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean sparing people from pain. Sometimes saving someone means tearing them away from what they love most. Ethan sat down at the table and took out paper and pen. He began to write a letter to social services. He didn't know whether they would listen, but he had to try. He had to find a way to bring Lily and Margaret back together, or at least make sure Lily wouldn't be alone, because if he didn't, her accusation would haunt him forever. You're a bad person. No. He would prove her wrong. He would prove he wasn't someone who walked away. This time, he would not give up. He wrote for himself a list of things he needed to do, a plan, a goal. Learn about the process for temporary foster care, prove that he was capable of caring for Lily, find a way to reunite Margaret and Lily. Do not give up, no matter how hard it gets. He looked over the list again, then underlined the final line. Do not give up. The night was still dark, but inside Ethan a small flame had begun to burn, not the fire of anger, but the fire of resolve. He stood open the closet and pulled out the military uniform he hadn't worn since coming home. He brushed off the dust, smoothed the creases, and hung it neatly on the hanger. Tomorrow morning, he would wear it. He would walk into social services not as a drifter, but as a soldier, someone who had once fought for what was right. And this time, he would fight for Lily. The next morning, Ethan woke before the sky fully lightened. He showered, shaved, and combed his hair carefully. Then he put on the uniform, the pressed khaki shirt, the sharply creased dark trousers, and the combat boots polished until his reflection stared back at him. He looked at himself in the mirror. The man looking back was no longer lost. He was a warrior, someone who had faced death and remained standing. He stepped out of the rented room into the bright morning light, climbed into the old pickup truck, started the engine, and drove toward the center of town. Social services opened at 8 o'clock. He would be there before the doors unlocked. Along the way, he passed familiar houses. He remembered stepping off the bus that first day, dust clinging to his shoes. He remembered the feeling of being adrift, as if he didn't belong anywhere. But now he knew exactly where he belonged. He belonged where someone needed him. He belonged where he could make a difference. He belonged beside Lily. The truck came to a stop in front of the drab gray building of the social services office. Ethan looked up at the sign, Willow County Department of Social Services. He took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck, and walked inside. This time he was no longer a bystander. He was a man in motion, and he would not stop until Lily came home. Ethan stood in front of the desk of Susan Carter, head of the county's social services department. Susan looked at him over the rim of her gold-rimmed glasses, her expression guarded and skeptical. "Mr. Reeves, I understand your intentions," she said, her voice slow and cautious. "But taking guardianship of a child isn't as simple as you may think. Do you have stable housing, a steady job, any experience caring for children?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I have a place to live, even if it's small. I'm actively looking for stable work. As for experience," he paused, then met her gaze directly. "I've commanded a unit under the harshest conditions imaginable. I know what responsibility means, and I don't quit." Susan nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Dr. Thompson sent me a letter recommending you. She said you saved Lily's life. That matters. But saving a life once is very different from providing day-to-day care." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "But the child needs stability. She doesn't need a system, she needs a person." Susan studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, I'll allow a 3-month trial. Temporary guardianship. If there are any issues, we will step in immediately. Ethan felt as if a massive weight had lifted from his chest. He nodded. "Thank you." 2 days later, Lily stood in front of Ethan's small house, an old backpack slung over her shoulder, her face closed off and distant. She didn't look at him, didn't say a word. She simply walked inside as though entering a place of confinement. Ethan stood in the doorway, unsure what to say. He had prepared the small bedroom for her, cleaned it thoroughly, bought new bedding, even hung a picture of a star-filled sky. But when Lily stepped inside, she only glanced around briefly, then sat down on the corner of the bed, hugging her knees and turning her face toward the wall. Are you hungry?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. Lily didn't respond. He stood there for a moment, then quietly backed out and closed the door softly. He knew she needed time. Still, her silence felt like an invisible wall standing between them. The next morning, Ethan decided to make breakfast. He opened the refrigerator and took out eggs, bread, and butter. He had cooked in the military before, but those meals had been basic rice canned soup. This time he wanted to do something better. He cracked the eggs into the pan. A loud sizzle erupted, smoke rising quickly. He frowned and turned down the heat, but it was already too late. The smell of burning filled the kitchen. He hurried to turn off the stove and stared down at the blackened eggs stuck to the bottom of the pan. "Damn it," he muttered. A soft giggle sounded behind him. Ethan turned around and saw Lily standing in the doorway. Her face was still guarded, but the corner of her mouth curved slightly upward, the first smile he had seen since she arrived. Do you know how to cook?" she asked, her voice light as a breeze. Ethan gave a sheepish smile. "I used to cook for an entire unit. Guess I forgot how." Lily stepped closer and looked into the pan. "I can help you." Ethan blinked. "You know how to cook?" She nodded. "I had to cook for Grandma." She couldn't remember how. The words cut quietly but deeply into Ethan's chest. He looked at her, a child not yet 10 years old, who had been forced to care for an adult. He knelt slightly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said gently. "I'll take care of you now." Lily looked at him. Her eyes still held doubt, but there was something softer there too. The days that followed passed in a mix of awkwardness and patience. Ethan learned how to braid hair, a skill he had never imagined needing. The first time he sat behind Lily holding a comb and hair ties, trying to divide her hair into sections. "What are you doing?" Lily asked as her hair was pulled too tight. "I'm braiding your hair," Ethan replied, his voice tense as if he were defusing a bomb. "You're doing it wrong. Let me." She turned around and braided her own hair in under a minute. Ethan watched, both impressed and faintly helpless. "You're really good at that," he said, smiling awkwardly. Lily shrugged. "I had to do it myself growing up." Once again he realized how early she had been forced to grow up. She hadn't been given a childhood like other kids. That evening, Ethan sat on the worn sofa, watching Lily sit on the floor, drawing with colored pencils. She drew a small house with windows, a chimney, and 2 figures standing at the door, one tall, one small. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Lily didn't look up. "Grandma and me." Ethan said nothing. He knew she missed her grandmother. He knew she hadn't forgiven him yet for letting Margaret be taken away. "I promise I'll take you to visit Grandma," he said. "This weekend." Lily looked up, her eyes lighting up. Really, Ethan said firmly. "I promise." This time, Lily smiled a real smile without pretense. And in that moment, Ethan felt that all the awkwardness, all the burnt meals, all the failed attempts at braiding hair, it was all worth it, because she was beginning to trust him. And that was the beginning of a long journey, one that would not only save Lily, but also rescue Ethan himself from the shadows of his past. On Sunday morning, golden sunlight streamed through the car windows, casting dancing streaks of light across Lily's face. She sat in the back seat, her hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the passing scenery, while her thoughts drifted far away. Ethan drove, glancing at her now and then in the rearview mirror. "Do you remember the way to the nursing home?" he asked, trying to break the silence. Lily nodded slightly. I remember. Her voice was as soft as a breeze, with a faint tremor in it, anticipation mixed with worry. Ethan understood that feeling. He knew she was afraid her grandmother wouldn't recognize her, afraid she might be angry that Lily hadn't stayed with her, afraid that nothing would be the same anymore. Your grandma will be very happy to see you, he said gently. I promise. Lily didn't answer, but she tightened her hands together as if trying to hold on to a fragile hope. Greenfield Nursing Home sat on the outskirts of town, a 2-story white building surrounded by rows of leafy trees and neatly kept lawns. Ethan took Lily's hand and led her inside. The faint scent of jasmine hung in the air, soft and warm, completely different from the damp, stale smell of the house on Willow Street. A nurse smiled at them. You're here to see Mrs. Margaret Wright. She's in room 203. Lily clutched Ethan's sleeve as they climbed the stairs. Each step felt heavy as if she were climbing a steep hill. When they reached the door to room 203, she stopped, unable to step inside. Ethan knelt to her eye level. Are you scared? Lily nodded, tears glistening. I'm afraid Grandma won't remember me. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice sincere. Whether she remembers or not, she has always loved you. And you're still the granddaughter she's always been proud of. Lily took a deep breath, then nodded. Ethan opened the door, and they stepped inside. Margaret was sitting by the window, sunlight illuminating her white hair. She was gazing outside, her hands resting gently in her lap, her expression calm. Hearing their footsteps, she turned around. Grandma Lily called out, her voice trembling. Margaret looked at her, her eyes cloudy at first, then slowly brightening. A gentle smile spread across her face, the smile Lily had missed every single day. My granddaughter. You've come, she said, her voice weak but full of affection. Lily ran to her, knelt beside her, and wrapped her arms around her grandmother's thin hands. Tears poured down her face, tears of joy, of longing, of relief. Grandma, I've missed you so much, Lily said through her sobs. Margaret stroked her hair, her eyes tender. I've missed you too. Are you well? Are you eating properly? Lily nodded. I'm fine. I'm living with Uncle Ethan now. He's very good to me. Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting Ethan's as he stood quietly by the door. She smiled. Young man, thank you for taking care of my little girl. Ethan stepped closer and bowed his head slightly. It's what I should do, ma'am. Margaret held Lily's hand, her voice gentle but firm. Listen to Uncle Ethan, dear. He's a good man. Grandma trusts him. Lily looked at her grandmother, then turned to Ethan. In her eyes, the anger and suspicion that once lived there had faded. In their place was understanding, and understanding that Ethan had not harmed her grandmother. He had saved them both. They sat with Margaret for nearly an hour. Lily told her about the new house, about Ethan's breakfasts, often burnt, about how he tried to braid her hair. Margaret laughed, her soft laughter like wind chimes. When it was time to leave, Lily hugged her grandmother tightly, unwilling to let go. I'll come visit you every week, Grandma. I promise. Margaret nodded, cupping Lily's cheek. I believe you. Ethan led Lily out of the room. She turned back for one last look and waved. Margaret waved back, her smile still bright. On the drive home, the car was quiet. Lily gazed out the window, but this time her eyes were no longer sad. She felt lighter, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her small shoulders. Ethan drove, his own mind no longer as tense as it had been on the way there. He had feared the visit might deepen Lily's pain. Instead, he saw her smiling, a small smile, but one full of meaning. Suddenly, he felt something touch his hand. He glanced down. Lily had climbed into the front seat and was gently holding his little finger with her small hand. She didn't say anything. She held on lightly, as if afraid he might pull away. But Ethan didn't. He closed his hand around hers, not tightly, just enough for her to know he was there and that he wasn't going anywhere. Uncle, Lily said softly. Yes, sweetheart, I'm sorry. Ethan looked at her, surprised. What are you sorry for? I said you were a bad person. But I was wrong. Tears slid down her cheeks again. You're the best person I've ever met." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what to say. He simply squeezed her hand gently, letting her know he understood. "I'm sorry too," he said hoarsely, "for letting you go through so much. But I promise from now on I'll always be here with you." Lily nodded, smiling through her tears. The car continued down the long road. The late afternoon sun sank low, painting the sky in shades of gold. And in that moment, Ethan felt the old wound in his leg, the one from the battlefield that always ached when it rained, no longer hurt. Because for the first time in many years, he didn't feel alone. He had Lily, and Lily had him. They had found each other, two lost souls who had finally found their way home. The Willow County Courthouse was bathed in spring sunlight, warm, gentle light full of promise. Ethan sat on a hard wooden bench dressed neatly in a black suit, one hand gripping his tie as if it were an anchor keeping him tethered to reality. Beside him, Lily sat quietly, her small hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead on the judge's bench. Judge Harrison, a silver-haired man with a stern face softened by kind eyes, flipped through a thick case file. He looked down at Ethan and Lily, then let out a small sigh. "Mr. Ethan Reeves." The judge began, his voice low and steady. "The court has carefully reviewed your case. Over the past 3 months, you have demonstrated your ability to care for Lily. Reports from her school, her physician, and social services have all been very positive." Ethan clenched his hands, forcing himself to breathe evenly. His heart pounded as if he were awaiting a verdict that could change his entire life. Judge Harrison turned his attention to Lily. "Lily, are you happy living with Uncle Ethan?" Lily stood up. Her voice was soft but clear. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm very happy. Uncle Ethan takes good care of me. He helps me with my homework, he cooks for me, and he always takes me to visit my grandma." The judge nodded and smiled faintly. "Very good, my dear." He struck the gavel, the sound echoing through the courtroom. The court grants long-term guardianship of Lily Margaret Thompson to Mr. Ethan Reeves. This decision takes effect immediately. It felt as though a beam of light pierced the darkness and flooded Ethan's chest. He turned to Lily, and for the first time in months he saw her cry, but not tears of sadness. These were tears of joy, of safety, of a future no longer hanging by a thread. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, everything might vanish like a dream. Winter passed and spring returned. Cherry blossoms bloomed throughout Maple Hollow, painting the town in soft shades of pink. Ethan found a job at a nearby woodworking shop, hard work but steady. Every morning he rose early, made breakfast for Lily, took her to school, then drove to the shop. In the afternoons, he picked her up, helped her with homework, cooked dinner, and listened as she told him about her day. Life wasn't perfect. There were still nights when Ethan woke from nightmares, and moments when Lily cried quietly because she missed her grandmother. But they had each other, and that mattered more than anything else. One weekend afternoon, Ethan took Lily to the house at 47 Willow Street, Margaret's old home. The house was still standing, but social services had temporarily transferred responsibility to Ethan so he could repair it. "We're going to repaint this house," Ethan said, holding a bucket of white paint. "So when Grandma comes to visit on weekends, she'll see a beautiful place." Lily beamed. "I'll help you." They got to work. Ethan painted the walls. Lily painted the window frames. The scent of fresh paint filled the air, not the sour, neglected smell of before, but the smell of renewal, of hope. Lily looked around the house, her face glowing. "Uncle, can I draw something on the wall?" Ethan smiled. "What do you want to draw?" "I want to draw a family," Lily said innocently. "A family with you, me and Grandma." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He nodded. "All right, go ahead." Lily took out her colored pencils and began drawing on the clean white wall. She drew 3 figures, a tall one, a small one, and an elderly one. They stood side by side, holding hands, smiling. Above them was a deep blue sky, a bright sun, and soft drifting clouds. Ethan stared at the drawing, his chest overflowing with emotion. He wasn't Lily's biological father. He wasn't her blood relative, but in this picture, he was part of her family. And that was something he had never dared to dream of. When the drawing was finished, Ethan carefully removed it, framed it, and hung it in the living room. The afternoon light streamed in, making the picture glow. Lily stood beside him, looking at it proudly. "Do you like it?" "It's beautiful," Ethan said sincerely. "The most beautiful picture I've ever seen." Lily took his hand and smiled. "I love you?" Those three simple words, so small yet so heavy with meaning, froze Ethan in place. He bent down and looked into her eyes, and for the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a soldier who had come home from war. He was a protector, an uncle, a father. "I love you too," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. That evening, when everything was finished, Ethan and Lily sat on the front steps of number 47 Willow Street, gazing up at a sky full of stars. A gentle breeze carried the scent of cherry blossoms. Uncle Lily asked, "Do you think everything will always be okay?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I don't know what the future will bring, sweetheart. But I do know this: no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Lily nodded and rested her head on his shoulder. "I believe you." Ethan looked up at the sky, and for the first time in many years, he no longer saw the ghosts of the past. He saw only the stars, small but brilliant lights guiding those who have lost their way. He had been lost, but now he had found his way home, and that road led to Lily. On Saturday morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. Summer sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across Lily's sleeping face. He smiled quietly, closed the door, and headed down to the shed. The day before, on his way home from work, he had spotted an old bicycle tossed along the roadside, its metal frame, rusted tires completely flat, the seat torn and worn. People had discarded it, convinced it was beyond saving. But Ethan had seen something else. He had seen an opportunity. He brought the bike home and hid it in the shed, and now he got to work. He took it apart, piece by piece, scrubbed away the rust, replaced the tires, and repainted the frame a bright blue, Lily's favorite color. Every hammer tap, every tightened bolt he handled with care, as though he were putting his own broken life back together. Lily woke around 9 and wandered into the kitchen, her hair sticking up in every direction. "Where are you, Uncle? I'm in the shed. Come on down," Ethan called. Curious Lily made her way outside. When she saw the gleaming bicycle in front of her, her eyes went wide. "Uncle, did you buy me a bike?" Ethan wiped his hands and smiled. "I didn't buy it. I fixed up an old one." "An old one?" Lily stepped closer, lightly touching the handlebars. "But it looks brand new." "That's what I want to teach you," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. "Just because something's been thrown away doesn't mean it has no value. Sometimes it just needs someone to believe in it and give it a second chance." Lily looked at the bike, then at him. "Like you and me," Ethan nodded, deeply moved. "Exactly. I used to be like this bike too, rusted, broken, and abandoned. But you gave me a second chance at life." That afternoon, Ethan taught Lily how to ride along the dirt road in front of the house. She fell many times, scraped knees, bruised hands. But every time she fell, she got back up, determined to try again. "Are you scared?" Ethan asked, helping her to her feet. "I am," Lily admitted. "But I remember what you said. Falling isn't scary. What's scary is not getting back up." Ethan smiled. "I'm proud of you." After dozens of attempts, Lily finally found her balance. She pedaled slowly at first, then faster, her laughter ringing out in the summer air. Ethan ran alongside her, one hand steadying the seat, then little by little he let go. Lily was flying on her own. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Ethan sat on the front steps looking at the bicycle leaning against the wall. He thought about the lesson the bike had taught him. Everything deserves a second chance, objects and people alike. He had once believed he was broken beyond repair, but Lily had shown him that with love and patience, anything could be mended. Ethan looked up at the star-filled sky and whispered, "Thank you, Lily. You saved me." And in the quiet night, the breeze seemed to carry Lily's soft laughter, the laughter of a child who had found her faith in life again. The story of Ethan and Lily is a gentle yet profound reminder that what truly makes a hero is not what they have fought or what they have lost, but the choice they ultimately make, the choice not to turn away. To stay when things become complicated, to stay when silence hurts more than tears, and to stay in the belief that a small child, a person who seems forgotten, still deserves to be loved and protected. Ethan did not save Lily with strength or the title of a soldier, but with patience, compassion, and the courage to face his own fears. And in guiding a child out of the darkness of abandonment, he also slowly led himself out of an unhealed past, out of years of guilt and loneliness. Every day, somewhere around us, there are still Lilies who are forced to grow up too soon, learning how to endure in silence. And there are also Ethans walking through life with hearts full of cracks, unaware that they themselves, through a small choice, a moment of pause, a decision not to walk away, can become a source of strength for someone else and for themselves. If this story has touched you, consider subscribing to continue walking alongside stories about people, about kindness, and about moments that seem small, yet hold the power to change an entire life. Please share this story with those you love, because the more people learn to slow down, to look more deeply at what is hidden behind silence, and to choose to stay with one another in the most fragile moments, the more children will be protected, the more families will be kept from falling apart, and the more souls will find their way home. If you are walking through a dark stretch of your life, please remember this: you are not weak for needing someone, and you are not alone. There is always a hand ready to reach for yours if you allow it. Do not give up, do not turn away from silence, and never underestimate the power of staying.